This is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. Given what's happening in the Middle East, particularly Gaza, some people might think that it would require a little bit of chutzpah, or what my grandmother would call as chutzpah, to write a book about how Judaism is all about love. However, my guest today, Shai Held, has done exactly that. He is very much involved. He's the president and dean of the Hadar Institute in New York City, Center for Advanced Jewish Learning, and a man, I think, of the left within the Jewish community. And he's joining us from White Plains today. Shai, congratulations on the new book. Leaving aside the issue of chutzpah, if you're right, if Judaism is all about love and you're trying to retrieve or resurrect that tradition within the faith, is it compatible in your view with Zionism?
Yes, I think it is compatible with Zionism. I think the challenge is that Zionism has always meant a lot of different things. When I was teaching a course on the history of Zionism to rabbinical students many years ago, I often used to say that the course should be called Zionisms, not Zionism. There have been all kinds of different visions of what it would mean for the Jewish people to return to the land that they longed for 2,000 years. So I don't think there's anything inherently contradictory at all between Judaism being about love and Zionism being a yearning for Jewish return to the land of Israel. No.
We'll get into your notion of love in a second, but I guess what I meant by the question was, if you have a state, for better or worse, you have to deal with issues of militarism and war and all the other issues that go along with having a state. So that was the point of my question. If you do indeed have a religion which, as you argue, is all about love, isn't it more suitable in the pre-Zionist Jewish tradition where there wasn't a state?
Well, so that's an interesting question. I think that what I would say is, look, all spiritual ideals are massively challenged when they are forced sort of to meet the concrete reality of statecraft. I mean, Lord knows the history of Christianity is filled with almost unspeakable brutality in the name of a God of love. So for sure, that's a really important question. And, one of the temptations that one might have as a religious person is to say, well, religion is just about the private and the interpersonal, because that's where love can play itself out. I think it's more challenging, more difficult, obviously, to try and talk about how a tradition that is about love can speak to the reality of geopolitics. That is really very hard. Now, of course, the Israeli state does not see itself as governed by Judaism, right? It's a secular state. But I think the issues you raise are obviously important and very difficult for all religious traditions. As soon as the rubber hits the road, things get much harder.
Although, and I don't want to turn this into a conversation about the current situation in Israel or Gaza, what you call the Israeli secular state is certainly under assault from the right and perhaps even the current prime minister. Let's get to the thesis, though, of your book, because it's not a book about Israel, it's a book about Judaism. What's the thesis, Rabbi Held, in Judaism is about love? Are you suggesting that, to excuse the pun, is the heart of the religion?
I am suggesting that. I mean, I use the subtitle "Recovering the Heart of Jewish Life." I mean, they are heart in both senses of the word: heart in the sense of core, and heart in the sense of our heart, kind of the claim it makes on our inner world. Look, I think that it's helpful to think about the project of this book in the context of centuries of Christian anti-Judaism. Historians have pointed out that Christianity traditionally told a story about the world in which Judaism was a loveless religion and Christianity came along to sort of fill the lacuna, if you will, in Jewish life. And one of the things that I suggest is that over thousands of years, many Jews internalized that Christian anti-Semitic, anti-Judaic trope, such that even Jews began to say, oh, Judaism is not about love. Judaism is about something else, like justice or law, etc. Now, what I'm trying to argue, though, is nuanced. I'm not saying that Judaism is about love to the exclusion of things like law or justice, but rather that love is the red thread that animates the whole project of Jewish life.
So what is love? I mean, you've obviously grappled with this subject. You've written a book about it. How would you define the L word, the four-letter L word?
Yeah, well, so I would say, for starters, at the risk of sounding like I'm evading your question, I don't think anyone should be foolhardy enough to attempt a straight up definition of what love is. But I think there's a few things we can say that are helpful. One is that love, as I'm using it in this book, and as I think the Jewish tradition tends to use it, is not an emotion. It has emotional dimensions, but it is more like an orientation, a way of holding ourselves. The term that I coined, that I find pretentious, but nevertheless helped me in my own thinking, love is an existential posture. Now, if you have a disposition to love and it never manifests as emotion, then it's not love that you have. But love is not equal to an emotion, so that I can say to someone, your life ought to be oriented around love, without telling them that their primary feeling at any particular moment ought to be love. Nobody feels anything all the time, right? So I think it's much more foundational and orienting than that. So, if you ask me as a Jew in the last 7 months, I would say my primary feeling tone has been indignation, frustration, bewilderment, loneliness, all kinds of things. But if you say to me, what's your orientation? I would still say love. And I think, if I can stay with this for just one moment, I think that that's important for a couple of reasons. One of them is that if you tell people that the spiritual life or the moral life is built on the feeling of love, then one of two things will happen. Either people lie to themselves about the fact that they feel lots of other things too, like grief or disappointment or frustration, or they give up and say, I'm not capable of that. I can't feel love all the time. So when you talk about love as an orientation, as a disposition to feel and act in certain ways, you give people, on the one hand, a very hefty challenge, but at the same time, you allow them to acknowledge that the primary emotional state they experience at any given time is not necessarily going to be about love or compassion or gratitude.
If we had a Jewish comedian here, Shai, I'm not one, an aspiring one, they might describe, the idea of love as an existential posture would be a furniture store in White Plains, New York. But I'll try to avoid that joke.
You failed to avoid it, but nevertheless, go
But I
ahead.
got a little bit of a laugh out of you anyway. This issue of love, you still seem to be circling around it. But let's go back to this distinction between Christianity and Judaism. Can Judaism be a religion of love if it's rooted in a tribal quality, if it's rooted in excluding the vast majority of people from its faith? In your definition, is it just about Jews loving each other? Is it about God loving the Jews, or the Jews loving God? Or is it a more universal sense of loving humanity, even if not all of humanity is Jewish?
Well, so I think this is actually part of Judaism's creativity on this point, is that it's very much both. That Judaism insists that the path to the universal is through the particular rather than around it. So it starts with love of one's neighbor, meaning in Leviticus, one's fellow Jew, one's fellow member of the covenant, but it includes also love of humanity, of all human beings created in God's image. So it's sort of like asking, do I love my family or do I love my community? So the answer ideally is both. So the Jews are like a family and humanity is like a community, at least in this vision of how ethics would work. So, I call this Judaism's particularist universalism. An example of this that may be helpful to your listeners is that, you have among some Christians, for example, certain kinds of Lutherans, the idea that what it would mean to love your neighbor is to love every person in the world equally, what philosophers call equal regard. Most Christians, I think, reject that. And I would say all Jewish thinkers reject that, because Judaism, I think, works with the grain of nature rather than against it. That is to say, it's never going to say, oh, don't love your own children so that you love all children. It's going to say, love your own children, and then build that love out to include others as well. You know, you asked another question in there also about God. So one of the things that I argue at some length is that the idea that God has entered into a special covenant with the Jewish people has really never meant, and therefore God is indifferent to everyone else. I think you see that already played out in Deuteronomy in the Bible, where just as God gives the land to the Israelites, God also gives other lands to the Moabites, to the Ammonites, that is, to other Israelite neighbors, as if Deuteronomy wants to say God's story with Israel, the people of Israel, is not the only story God has going on.
Coming back to this issue, though, of the tribe and of the text, the God in the Old Testament, and you're the expert here, I'm not, but I've read a little bit about it, read a little bit of it. The God of the Old Testament is not very loving, is he? Very much of a male character, whereas in contrast, the God of the New Testament is certainly potentially more female and has more of a loving quality. Or is that another trope put forward in your view by Christians?
Yes, I referred to that in the book as a kind of pernicious stereotype. I think it's very problematic. Well, let's start with the negative and then back our way into the positive. The Christian Bible scholar Brent Strawn writes that for Christians who think that the Old Testament God is mean and violent, whereas the New Testament God is nice and loving, he invites them to read the book of Revelation, which outstrips anything in the Hebrew Bible by a lot in terms of its violence and almost grotesque, cruel fantasy. Look, I think what you have in the Bible is a lot of different voices and portraits. But I would say two things here at the risk of kind of doing a little biblical inside baseball, if you bear with me for just 1 minute.
Well, you're a big Yankees fan, so you would do that, wouldn't you, Rabbi?
Indeed. If you want to talk about the Yankees, we could talk about love constantly and my endless adoration for them, but which will win me no fans outside of the New York area, but so be it. The verses in the Bible that the Bible itself quotes most often are the verses in Exodus 34, where God is described as merciful, gracious, forgiving, etc. Right? The Bible never gets tired of returning to those verses as God's self-definition. God's love is part of God's very being in those texts. And then, of course, there is this remarkable passage in the prophet Hosea, which tells us that what makes God God rather than a human is precisely that God's love is inexhaustible. Right? Human love runs out. Divine love never runs out. That's hardly the Old Testament God of, all the stereotypes that are, put forward. Now, I don't pretend, I'm not an apologist in this sense. I don't pretend that I can make every difficult text in the Hebrew Bible, easy and fun to live with. I don't pretend that. But I do think the Bible is much richer and more complex than that stereotype would suggest.
You're a biblical scholar within the Jewish tradition. Of course, there are equivalents within Christianity and also equivalents within Islam. We've done shows about Christianity really being all about love and Islam really being all about love. Can't scholars like you, very learned men who have read these texts carefully, perhaps too carefully, can't you always cherry pick and find stuff that supports your thesis?
Well, so I think that question is really, really important, and it requires a kind of self-awareness about what we're doing. And one of the things I say in the introduction to this book is that no tradition is a monolith, right? To borrow a term from a Christian theologian that I love, religious traditions are multiliths, right? They contain lots and lots of voices, lots and lots of texts, lots and lots of possibilities. If someone wanted to write a book called Christianity is About Hate, or Judaism is About Hate, or Islam is About Hate, they could do just that.
And of course, Christopher Hitchens and that tradition have done so and written best-selling books.
Right. although, so what I would say about that though is cherry picking is not the word I would use for what I'm doing, because I'm reading many of the most foundational canonical texts. I think the tradition itself already accentuates the texts within it that are about love. When we say, for example, in Judaism, that love your neighbor as yourself is the great principle of the Jewish tradition, we're saying something like Judaism is about love. But an honest reading of these traditions requires us also to reckon with the ugly stuff and the scary stuff and the xenophobic stuff. I don't think that it's responsible to step around that. And that's certainly not what I mean. One of the things that was important to me in the writing of this book is to stop and focus on texts that are disturbing rather than confirming of my thesis.
Lots of Jewish jokes, of course, about parents wanting their kids to be doctors and particularly lawyers. You suggest that the Judaism is much more about love than about the law or perhaps justice and scholarship. Is it an either or, Rabbi Held? Can't it be about both? Or is the law and justice, are they somehow antithetical, perhaps rooted in, especially when it comes to justice, rooted in traditions of antiquity that were uncomfortable with the thesis of love?
No, as I say, quite the contrary. You see, I think actually this is the dichotomy between love and law is a kind of heritage, you could argue, of Augustine, but certainly of Martin Luther. For the Jewish tradition, law is not an alternative to love, but rather a manifestation of it, right? Law is what God gives us. It's almost like you imagine a parent who wants a child to go out into the world with some wisdom, arming them to make their way in the world. That's, I think, for example, how Deuteronomy imagines the law. It's God giving the law, to quote a phrase from Deuteronomy, for your own flourishing. So I definitely do not mean to dichotomize between love and law. In fact, I'm trying to overcome the impulse to dichotomize that we find in some aspects of the Jewish tradition. And it's a very hard thing with Christian audiences in particular, right? No matter how many times I say Judaism is about love and law is a manifestation of that love, I'll have Christians say things like, oh, so you mean Judaism is about love, but not law? And I say, no, that's actually not how Judaism thinks about law. Law in Judaism is a gift, is a kind of precious revelation of divine love. We say that in Jewish liturgy every day. So I think it's important to be clear here. And justice too, right? I would argue that part of what ideally equips us to pursue justice is love for humanity and love of the world, not to mention love of God, right? Actually wanting the world to conform to God's vision of a just world. That I think can stem very deeply from love. And love might be the thing that can keep us going precisely when our struggles for justice, run up against a brick wall.
Yeah, of course, some of the Platonic dialogues focus on love, although the most famous, the Republic, focuses on the idea of justice, a definition of justice that leads to political notions of truth and justice. Where's the politics here, Shai?
Shai, but yeah.
Shai. I was going to call you Professor Held, but I'm going to call you Rabbi Held. Is this implicitly or otherwise, does this suggest a communitarianism when it comes to politics at the heart of the Jewish tradition?
That is a really interesting and difficult question, because what I always like to say is that the reading of classical sources has implications for politics, but doesn't necessarily determine them all the way down. Meaning, let's take a very concrete example for a minute. The idea of loving the outsider, or what the Bible calls the ger, or stranger, or sojourner. So, and that person is a non-member of the kin group who has come to live among you. We might say an immigrant. So the Bible makes it clear we're supposed to love immigrants. What it cannot do is tell us, okay, how many Syrian refugees should the United States take in a given year? It's absurd to think that an ancient Near Eastern text could do that. But what it can do, and I think does do, is establish an ethos, an orientation, a sort of way of comporting ourselves in relationship to certain kinds of people and certain kinds of social problems. I do think there is a kind of communitarian impulse in the Jewish tradition. We could argue how much of this is supposed to be done through government and how much of it is supposed to be done through community. I mean, there's things we could talk about, but let's put it this way. The idea that God's blessings are meant to be shared rather than hoarded, I think, lies at the heart of both the Jewish and the Christian traditions. That can't but have political and economic implications.
And then how does this all fit in with the long sordid history of anti-Semitism? You may be right. Judaism as a theology might be all about love, but of course, outsiders throughout history haven't loved the Jews, and there's this terrible history of anti-Semitism throughout the history of the Jewish people. Is this coincidental, or do you argue in the book that the more Jews are hated, the more Judaism becomes about love?
So the last piece of your question, no, I don't argue that the more Jews are hated, the more Judaism becomes about love. I think that would be a hard argument to make. Um, I think, look, one thing we can say about anti-Semitism and its interaction with Judaism and love is that I think one reason why the idea of love being at the heart of the Jewish tradition has been so submerged is that we know that minority groups frequently come to see themselves the way the majority group sees them. So I don't find it surprising at all that so many Jews adopted the Christian anti-Judaic lens about the Jewish tradition. I find it deeply tragic, but also actually on some level completely unsurprising.
So could you've said that a couple of times. Are you suggesting that somehow an anti-Semitic theology has infiltrated Judaism in the way in which Jews think about themselves and their faith?
I am suggesting that. I would say that Christians so insistently told the dominant story about how Christianity was about love and Judaism was not, that many Jews internalized it. Now, there's another dimension to it, and that has to do with American Jewish history, which is that I suspect this happened in the wake of World War II, but I can't prove it. American Jews who were anxious about assimilation and who didn't know a tremendous amount about Judaism began to define their Judaism as whatever they imagined Christianity was not. So, whereas Christianity, was about love, so then they said Judaism is about something else. A famous example of this is American Jews told themselves for generations that Judaism has no notion of the afterlife. Why? Because in their understanding of Christianity, Christianity is all about the afterlife. So Judaism must not be about the afterlife at all. Of course, this is totally false to the Jewish tradition. So I think you can show an array of examples where Jews ended up distorting their own faith in an attempt to separate themselves. So the overarching thesis that I'm sort of proposing to you here is that there is a kind of double whammy where on the one hand, the majority culture is telling the Jews that they're loveless. And then it gets worse in America when Jews, anxious about their own identity, say, okay, let's not be Christian. They say they're about love. We must be about something else. And that leads to, I think, impoverished conceptions of the Jewish tradition. So much so that, even many rabbis have internalized this narrative that Judaism isn't about love. And yet, if you read the sources, it's everywhere.
I don't want to become preoccupied with this, but why is it anti-Semitic? It may be wrong, but making this distinction, as you suggest, Christians have done historically between Judaism being about the law and Christianity being about love, that's not anti-Semitic, is it?
Well, so I think it's certainly anti-Judaic in that, let's think of it this way. Christianity says love is the highest ideal. Judaism is completely devoid of it.
Mm.
That is at minimum anti-Judaic, right?
Mm.
And anti-Judaism has often spilled over into anti-Semitism. Those lines can be hard to draw historically, right? I mean, anti-Judaism in the Christian church often manifested in anti-Semitic violence, right? Real Jews experienced in their bodies, if you will, the implications of Christian portrayals of Judaism. So I think it is very much anti-Judaic. It's not like someone saying, oh, Christians believe in the Trinity, but Jews don't. It's much more biting and harsh and degrading in its kind of energy than that.
There's a long tradition, certainly in Western secular thought, about self-love, warnings of self-love. Rousseau comes to mind. In your view, in your reading, Rabbi Held, are there continual warnings in the Judaic tradition about self-love?
You know, it's interesting. I've been getting asked this question a lot as I've traveled talking about the book. And one of the passages in the Jewish tradition that I've been sharing that I didn't write about in the book, but perhaps I should have, I don't think I wrote about it in the book at least, is that one prominent 20th century rabbinical figure, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook, observes how interesting it is that some people see self-love as the greatest of the virtues, while other people castigate self-love as the lowest of the vices. And that has sort of led me, me, Shai, to be wondering a lot about exactly what people mean when they talk about self-love, because my sense is, just from conversations with students over the years, is that people mean an incredible array of different things when they talk about self-love. So I would say certain versions of self-love, the idea that we are infinitely valuable, right, are actually deeply rooted in the Jewish tradition. Whereas other forms of self-love, the kind of self-love that kind of veers off into selfishness and self-centeredness, etc., the Jewish tradition casts a very dim view of. But, I've actually considered writing a book about all the different things that people have meant by self-love and whether it would help us in Western culture to be more clear about what we mean when we talk about it.
Yeah, Rousseau, of course, distinguished a good and a bad self-love. I wonder in the Jewish tradition whether it requires getting beyond time and space and thinking about oneself as a Jew within the timeless, spaceless community, as opposed to one single Jewish life.
I mean, I think there's some of that. I would also say, I mean, this is something I wrote about in my first book, which was about the theology of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Um, the idea that the spiritual life is in part about overcoming the illusion that our ego is the center of the world, and sort of what
Right.
it means to relativize our own ego, to realize that, my perception of the world is no more the center of the world than yours is, and the humility and the making space that ideally ensue from that awareness.
Although people will be encouraged or amused or horrified to know that Rabbi Held even has his own Twitter account. So there may even be a little bit of self-love in everyone, even the best rabbis. We are speaking with Shai Held, the author of Judaism is About Love, Recovering the Heart of Jewish Life. Fascinating conversation. I'm going to take a short break, and then I want to come back and end the show talking about the crisis, or what some might see as the crisis of Judaism in 2024. But I want to thank our friends at Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics. I wonder if Shai Held knows Leon Wieseltier, certainly a very influential figure also amongst American Jews. He's the father, the editor-in-chief of Liberties. We're going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back to talk more about whether or not Judaism, or how we're going to make Judaism more about love in 2024. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. Shai, are you familiar with Liberties? All our guests get a free subscription. So
I am a subscriber.
Good. Well, you can get another one. So you've given some interesting interviews about the book. It's obviously a controversial thesis. In Publishers Weekly, there was a question about what gives you hope at this latest dark time for the Jewish people. Is this a dark time in your view for the Jewish people? They have their own state. There are many, many prominent Jews around the world, guys like yourself. What's so dark about this moment?
Well, I think it depends a little bit on how we define this moment. I think the moment after October 7th has been a devastating moment for very many American Jews. A lot of them would give you different explanations of exactly what's been devastating about this moment. But, I regularly receive emails from professional colleagues in the Jewish world, which begin with things like, "I hope you're doing as well as possible." Meaning, I think there's a kind of universally shared sense that this is a really challenging time.
You mentioned after, was it October? What about after the invasion of Gaza, or would you distinguish between those two?
I mean, I think it's a package, right? The terrorist attacks of October 7th and then the Israeli military invasion of Gaza in the wake of that. I think, for one thing, we can say that peace in the Middle East seems farther away now than it has in at least a generation, if not more. And that is, unbearably tragic. And by the way, it relates to the thesis of my book. In a very simple way, that I would say that I think a lot of people have lost sight of, which is, look, if there's ever going to be a less blood-soaked time in the land of Israel, it will depend on two peoples developing empathy for one another's stories, for their suffering. I mean, there is no other way around that. And people can scoff at that and talk about how that's not realpolitik. I think at the end of the day, it is about humanizing each other. And right now, we're at an extremely low ebb in that process of humanizing one another.
Yeah, I think that's what you meant. You had an interesting op-ed in the New York Times in April about Passover's radical message. Is that radical message about humanizing suffering?
Yeah, I mean, the primary point of that essay, I actually intended to be on the personal sphere about what it means to take one's own suffering and learn empathy from it. But I think the same thing that is true of persons, if you will, is also true of peoples, which is ultimately, how do we learn empathy from our own suffering? That is very hard work. I mean, suffering, as we know, can make us brittle, can make us combative, can make us hateful. But the project of the Bible, I think, is to teach us love through suffering. That's a very tall order.
You wrote an interesting piece also in the foreword about the war, suggesting it's a call to action for religious Jews on the left. Are then, for you, religious Jews on the left, are they people in the empathy business, or trying to be empathetic, not just to the suffering of Jews, but the suffering of everyone? Is that what defines a religious Jew, a leftist religious Jew?
Well, look, I would say yes, but I don't mean that in a triumphalistic way, meaning I don't think people on the left are the only people who have empathy across borders, right? I think it's possible to have, conservative political views and still have boundary crossing empathy. But it is certainly the case that religious Jews on the left, I think, define themselves in part by a concern with humanity as a whole rather than just with the Jewish people, and with insisting that certain humanistic values are deeply rooted in the Jewish tradition and lie at its very core.
If you could snap your fingers, and Judaism did indeed get accepted as being about love. There was an interesting Washington Post piece from April as well about your book and a couple of others going back to the intellectual heritage and communal beliefs of Judaism. How would that change contemporary Judaism in America and perhaps in Israel? What would be different?
Well, I would say a couple of things, and they start on some level very small. It would mean that people growing up in Jewish communities would learn unequivocally that kindness is a higher value than success, that love is the ultimate ideal to strive for in one's life rather than, whatever else it might be that we learn in prep school or college or whatever. Right? So I think it's for starters about how we educate and what we educate for. What do we see as a successful product of a Jewish education? And I would argue that the primary metric of success for the tradition is that the person be a compassionate being, one who cares about others and responds to their needs. Then of course you move more expansively. I I like to say that my dream for the Jewish community is that someone passes a Jewish day school or a synagogue and says, oh, that's a Jewish institution. That must be a bastion of kindness, right? In other words, that's the aspiration. If religions want to compete with each other, let them compete over who can do the most good for the people in the most need. I think, that would be an extraordinary way for religions to place themselves in the world. In terms of Israel, it's a complicated question because as we know, radicals radicalize each other, right? So you have this constant back and forth radicalization between Israel and the Palestinians. I think that a Judaism that is about love understands first its own deep connection to the land and its own passion for and love for the history that it has with the land of Israel, and a Judaism that is about love at the same time recognizes that there is another people that has the same feelings and is committed to figuring out a way to share this place that both peoples love. That is the project. Now, I just want to say, good people can disagree fiercely about what that sharing ought to look like, but that ultimately neither Israelis nor Palestinians are going anywhere, I think is, the rock bottom truth of the Middle East.
Are there other religious, you've mentioned that you think that Christianity in some ways appropriated the love tradition in Judaism, turned it on its head and created a sort of odd anti-Semitism within Judaism itself. But are there other religious traditions in the world, perhaps outside the West, for which love is central? Buddhism, for example.
Yeah, I mean, so that question allows me to say one other thing that I think is helpful. Then I can answer the question more directly. Love, as I'm using it, and this is increasingly the case among moral philosophers in general, that love is an umbrella term for a whole array of pro-social postures: compassion, care, kindness, etc. I think Buddhism, certainly American Buddhism, is totally preoccupied with compassion as a virtue. And I think there's a really interesting conversation to be had among different traditions about different ways we might think about or conceptualize what compassion is. But for sure, there's a reason why many American Jews feel drawn to Buddhism, and there's a bunch of reasons. One of them, I think, is that they recognize a lot of the talk of compassion, and in American forms of Buddhism, there's less God talk, and a lot of American Jews trip up on the God talk. So Buddhism becomes a very appealing alternative for a lot of American Jews.
Final question, Rabbi Held. Speaking of God talk, where's the need for God? What's the need for God talk in all this? You can have theologies or perhaps ideologies of love, philosophies of love without the gods. Where's the place of a God? Jewish God, Christian God, Muslim God, Hindu God? Why even bother with the gods in all this?
Well, so I'm not invoking God just to make my argument about love work, right? God is not there to sort of solve my philosophical needs, if you will, right? God, the reason that I believe in God, I would say it this way: the reason I believe in God when I do believe in God has to do with a whole array of different things, like my experiences, the experiences of my ancestors, and also at the end of the day, I find that if you want to believe that there is a moral reality, if you're a moral realist, if you think there are moral facts, that it is objectively wrong in the universe to murder an innocent person, I think that's a lot easier to make sense of with a God than without one. As you may know, there's a lot of discussion about whether and how you can have moral realism without God, but you certainly can have it with. And moral experience is one of the things that, for me, points to something transcendent